Blade Runner the RPG landed on Kickstarter and caused a little bit of a swirl in the Year Zero Engine community waters because it is using the stepped dice mechanic found previously in Twilight 2000 instead of the more common D6 dice pool mechanic found in all of the other Year Zero Engine games. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it the future of the Year Zero Engine? Well, I think regardless of whether it is the new format used going forward, which I don't think it will be. I think we might see more games like this using this step dice mechanic, but I don't think it's only going to be step dice mechanic going forward. I don't think it's a bad thing, and I'm gonna reveal my reasons for that as we go through this video. So to start off, let's take a closer look at the Blade Runner mechanic in detail, and then we're going to be comparing it to Twilight 2000 and also comparing it to the D6 dice pool systems. So up on this little graphic is a snippet from the PDF from Blade Runner, and I'm using this because it's a very, very nice, concise summary of how the dice mechanic works. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be leaving this graphic up on the screen as we go through, and we're going to be comparing Twilight 2000 to this mechanic and also the Year Zero Engine mechanics to this snippet, to this graphic as well. So what we start off with are the base dice in Blade Runner, and that is a combination of 2 dice, and these 2 dice can be stepped up from a d6 up to a d12. So 4 combinations, d6, d8, d10, d12, and you're usually always rolling both dice, 2 dice. And that's because unlike in the Year Zero Engine where you can have a skill rank of 0, in Blade Runner, you start off with a level D, which is a D6, in all of your skills, and you can step them up by basically increasing them with experience points, or at starting at character creation, you have a certain number of points that you can increase your skills by. So you're always rolling 2 dice unless modifiers come into play. So that's the first bit to do with Blade Runner. Success is measured by how many 6s or higher you're rolling on these 2 base dice. The exception is if you're rolling a d10 or a d12, where you can actually get 2 successes on each of those dice on a 10, 11, or a 12. So if you roll 10 or higher, you're getting 2 successes. Otherwise, a 6, 7, or 8, or 9, you're going to be getting 1 success. Okay? That means if you're maxing out your character and you have 2 d12, the best possible result you can roll from them is 2 12s, which would give you 4 successes. And compare that to the D6 dice pool Year Zero Engine games, where the maximum you could be rolling, again without modifiers, would be a dice pool of 12 dice. And you could theoretically roll all 6s on all 10 dice, and you could roll a maximum of 10 successes. So the probabilities of that, without having looked at them, are going to be minute. So the probability of rolling 10 6s on 10 d6, very, very, very tiny compared to rolling 2 12s on 2 d12. If anybody in the comments wants to give me the exact probability differences in those, go ahead. I haven't actually looked those up. Okay, so that's success. Then advantage is where things really get interesting here. In Blade Runner, if you have advantage, so all the various different things that might be an advantage and all the various things that might be a disadvantage, you weigh them up, they cancel each other out until you're left with you're either in an advantageous position or a disadvantageous position. And regardless of the two, whether you're in one or the other, one thing is going to happen one way or the other. If you have advantage, regardless of whether it's a little bit of advantage or a lot of advantage, you take a 3rd die and you step it up to match the lowest of your other 2 base dice. So if you have a d6 and a d10, you're going to be adding another d6 to your dice pool and rolling that. And any successes rolled on that 3rd dice count towards your total. Conversely, if you have disadvantage, whether that's a little bit of a disadvantage or a lot of disadvantage, you're going to remove the lowest die from your 2 base dice. So in which case you're only rolling your highest of the 2. Now, at first I was kind of scratching my head and thinking, I'm not sure I like that, but the more I thought about it, it's quite quick, there's a lot to be said for that. And also it means that if we look at it from the 2 different perspectives, from advantage, it basically is saying, if you're basing it on your lowest of the two base dice, right? So if you're doing something where you have a high core capability, so we're talking about raw physicality or dexterity, whatever, but you're not particularly skilled, then yeah, your raw capability is still going to be there, but because you're not particularly skilled in it, you're not going to be getting a huge advantage, right? So on the flip side, if you're very highly skilled at something, but you're not particularly gifted in terms of raw capabilities, so you have a lot of experience in hand-to-hand combat, let's say, for like a close combat type of role. That's probably, combat's a little bit different. Actually, combat doesn't use these advantages as much. We'll use it anyway, right? So you're quite weak physically, but you've done a lot of training in how to use like close hand-to-hand combat. That means when you have the advantage, your raw physicality, your strength is going to be the bottleneck, and it's only going to give you a d6. So you're kind of benefiting more when you're hitting the mid-range values for these things. So having mid-level skill and having mid-level capability is really going to give you the best bonus when it comes to getting advantage. And I think in most cases that's going to, especially in sort of mid-game to late game, as your character is gaining more experience, you're going to be kind of balancing out. Most players go the jack of all trades route, where they're kind of balancing out a lot of their skills to make them generally more successful at more things, rather than min-maxing and saying, I want to be the best at this particular type of thing. Because if you're tending to min-max, you're likely to be quite limited in a lot of areas where this advantage is going to come into play. And arguably, when the advantage would come into play, the things that you're really good at, you're already going to have relatively high levels of success anyway, so it's not going to necessarily, it's not really doing a lot. So anyway, that's how it works. Flip side with a disadvantage, I mean, taking away the lower of the two dice and really being left with one die is quite crippling, but at the same time, it means either you're focusing on your raw capability or you're training in something, depending on which is better. And if you're not either well trained or you don't have a good capability in something, then it's a fairly big disadvantage anyway. Like you'd only be rolling 2d6 and you're taking one of them away. It's kind of the same as taking 1d6 away from a dice pool anyway. So I kind of like it in theory. I haven't actually played Blade Runner. I haven't run Blade Runner yet. So this is all theory crafting, really. But on paper, at first I was kind of a little bit, not shocked, but I was a little bit taken back by the lack of granularity in advantage and disadvantage. But the more I thought about it and played through a little bit some scenarios in my mind, the more I actually liked it and think it's quite an elegant way of approaching this issue. And the last thing to look at is pushing. Pushing in Blade Runner works with, if you fail a roll, you can re-roll, and any one that shows up, which are shown with the origami unicorn on the dice, on the special dice, is going to inflict stress or damage on you based on whether it's a mental or a physical attribute you're rolling. And that's pretty straightforward. We see a similar mechanic in Vaesen. We see a similar mechanic in Twilight 2000, but we'll be talking about those in a minute. So that's the dice mechanic in Blade Runner. And I guess the only thing to talk about is how gear plays into this. Weapons don't actually give you any kind of advantage. They don't give you any extra dice, which is a very, very different thing than we've seen in, I think, any of the other Year Zero Engine games. The difference, I guess, is that in Twilight 2000, you also don't have bonus dice, but you have ammo dice. So close combat weapons don't really kind of follow the same format here in Blade Runner, but in Twilight 2000, if you're using a firearm, you would get ammo dice, and that adds dice to the pool. You get some d6 you can add, and it's a kind of a slightly crunchier but interesting way of handling that. You don't have that at all here in Blade Runner. So in Blade Runner, you're basically just rolling your base dice, and some gear will give you an advantage. In fact, quite a few of the non-combat related gear gives advantage to medical or first aid or whatever the skill is called exactly in Blade Runner. So, if you're using some sort of medical kit, you're going to get a boost to your medicine, your medical, your first aid type of roll. And that's how it's handled. So, in Twilight 2000, it's done a little bit differently with the base dice. It's mostly the same, with one exception, and that is you can have a level F rather than a level D in some skills. And that means you don't actually... you might have no training in a skill at character creation, and therefore you would only roll one base die when you're making a roll for that skill. Successes work the same, exactly the same. You get a success on a 6, 7, 8, or 9, and you get 2 successes on a 10, 11, or a 12. So D10s and D12s offer slightly better chances of rolling more successes. Advantage works differently. Advantage in Twilight 2000 has you stepping up or stepping down your base dice. And what you're trying to do is you're always trying to balance the dice. That means you're trying to, if you have advantage, then you're stepping up the lower of the 2 base dice. So if they're kind of like here, one's a D12 and one's a D8, and you have one advantage, this D8 would step up to a D10. Likewise, if you have disadvantage, you're trying to balance the dice out again, so you're dropping your D12 down to a D10 to bring it closer to the D8. And you can actually have multiple steps of advantage or disadvantage, so you can have things kind of going up and down and then maybe coming down again, or this one's coming up and then maybe one more goes up. So you're basically, there's more granularity in terms of advantage and disadvantage. And that was the big shocker when I first looked at Blade Runner, is that it lost that granularity in just saying, yes, you have advantage, roll an additional dice, or no, you don't have advantage, take your lower die away. Pushing in Twilight 2000 is kind of the same, where every one you roll on your pushed dice results in 1 damage, but it differs in that there is a reliability stat on your equipment, and in Twilight 2000, those ones damage your equipment first before they damage you. So that's a very small kind of tweak, but more or less the same mechanic. And that's, in a nutshell, the difference between Twilight 2000 and Blade Runner. And the big difference, as you can see there, is that advantage is where things differ. And that is, in a nutshell, why Twilight 2000 is crunchy and Blade Runner isn't. Twilight 2000 has so many different modifiers for where you add or remove, where you add advantage or you add disadvantage, that it just makes for a very crunchy experience as you're basically fiddling around with a lot of various different modifiers. And then there's a lot of other crunch, of course, added on to the rest of the system as well, in terms of combat and in terms of all the various options available to you, which Blade Runner just doesn't have. So really the core dice mechanic, though, between the two is very, very, very similar, and it really just differs in advantage and in character creation, I guess, where in Blade Runner you're always going to be starting with a single die in all of your skills, whereas in Twilight 2000, the majority of your skills often don't give you any second die. Okay, so let's compare now how this step dice mechanic works to the rest of the Year Zero engine. And to look at them, I'm going to be taking one of my favorite Year Zero engine games, Vaesen, in terms of the core mechanic. And I'm also taking this because it's a very straightforward way of looking at things as well. And I'll be comparing, really the difference between all the different dice pool Year Zero engine games is where you get to pushing, more or less. There are some other changes as well, but really pushing is where things really get different. But there are some differences in some of the other areas as well. But we'll go through them one step at a time and talk through them. So let's start with the base dice. And really the difference between the step dice system and the dice pool system is that in the dice pool games, the way it works is you look at your attributes, you look at your skills, and you look at any gear you might have, and basically for every rank you have in those 3 things, you add a d6 to your dice pool. So if you have an attribute of 3, you have a skill of 2, and you have a piece of equipment with a gear bonus of 1, you're rolling 6 dice. That's 3 for the attributes, plus 2 for the skill, and the 1 for the gear. So you're rolling 6 dice. Successes are very similar here, that if every 6 on a die is a success. And the difference between the various different dice pool games is that some of them only require a single success to succeed, and extra 6s might be called something like stunts, or they might give you some extra benefit. Coriolis has, if you have 1 or 2 successes, it's called a partial success, and you need 3 or more successes to get what's considered a critical success, which is kind of like a full success, but even better. Well, a critical success, basically. And then in in Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood, and also in Vaesen, you might need more than 1 success depending on the difficulty of the task that you're rolling against. So most normal difficulty tasks require a single success, but if it's particularly difficult, rather than taking dice away, you might need more. Okay, so that brings us to advantage. As I've just said, most of the games, in fact, all of the games, if you have advantage, are adding dice to your dice pool. And where it differs between the various different Year Zero Engine games, the dice pool Year Zero Engine games, is that disadvantage can either remove dice from your pool, or it can add the number of required successes, as we've just talked about with Twilight, Things from the Flood, Tales from the Loop, and Vaesen. I don't know why I keep wanting to say Twilight 2000 because it starts with a T, I guess. Right, so pretty straightforward. Advantage adds dice, and disadvantage either takes them away or requires more successes. Okay, now let's talk about pushing. And pushing is where things really change between the various dice pool systems. In Vaesen and Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood, you take a condition every time that you want to push. So you're harming yourself to push your roll. In Alien, you add a stress die to your pool, and that's basically it. You want to push, take some additional stress. And Alien has a really cool stress mechanic that ties into panic. That's very interesting. But that's basically how pushing works there. In Mutant Year Zero and Forbidden Lands, you're looking for ones, like Blade Runner and Twilight 2000 a little bit, but you have 3 different dice. You have base dice, skill dice, and gear dice. And on the base dice and on the gear dice, the ones have a special symbol, and if any of those special symbols, like a skull or an explosion, depending on the game you're playing, if those symbols on the one show up after you've pushed, then you're either damaging your gear or you're damaging the attribute you've rolled against. And that's quite a nice, interesting little mechanic, but it does kind of require that you have 3 separate pools of dice, so it's a little bit less accessible than some of the other dice pool games. And finally, Coriolis. In Coriolis, if you want to push a roll, you take a darkness point. And darkness points are this meta currency for the GM that they can use to basically mess around with the player characters or the players. You can pray, or you can go to a chapel to prepare, and in which case you can negate the GM getting a darkness point. But generally speaking, you get a darkness point if you want to push the roll. And that is, in a nutshell, how the dice pool games work compared to Blade Runner and Twilight 2000, the step dice system. And as you can see, there's not a huge amount of difference between the two. Where it really changes is in pushing, but pushing has always been different in all the different games anyway. So I think in that, having a slightly different system for pushing doesn't really make that much of a difference. And really what we're seeing here in Blade Runner and Twilight 2000 isn't that different from what we've seen in Vaesen and Things from the Flood and Tales from the Loop anyway, which is to push, you take damage. But it's also only on a 1, so it's kind of a unique thing. It's kind of a hybrid between the Vaesen system and the Forbidden Lands or Mutant Year Zero system. And yeah, it's just kind of interesting. I quite like the way they've done pushing here. It feels very Year Zero engine-y to me, despite using the step dice. Okay, let's talk probabilities. And before you skip to the next section because you hate maths, let me just give you the too long didn't watch recap before I've done it. And that is, there's hardly any difference between the probabilities in the 2 different mechanics. The big differences are at the low end of the spectrum, where you're rolling with low attributes and low skills. and it's harsher in the step dice mechanic than in the dice pool mechanic. Okay, that's the too long didn't watch. If you don't want to hear the probabilities, go ahead and skip to the next section. Okay, all you other math nerds out there, let's look a little bit more at how these probabilities work. And up here, you're going to be seeing the probabilities. You've got on the left the stepped system, and I've taken that as a snippet from the Twilight 2000 PDF. On the right-hand side, you've got the dice pool snippet taken from the Vazen PDF. And rather than going through lots and lots of different combinations, I want to focus on where the differences are, so at the low end of the spectrum. Then I want to look at where things start balancing out. Then I'm going to be taking just one example from the middle of the spectrum, which is mid-attribute, mid-skill. And then I'm going to be looking at the extreme end of the spectrum, which is maximum attribute and skill from both types of core mechanics. Okay, so let's start with looking at when your character has the lowest possible attribute value. And let's start it off with no skill and start stepping up the skill ever so slightly, because this really is where we start seeing the differences. So when you have the lowest possible attribute in the step dice system, you're going to be rolling a single d6. Now, if you are playing Blade Runner, you're also going to have a d6 for your skill, because all your skills are at d6, so you're having 2 dice. If you're playing Twilight 2000, you're going to only going to be rolling a single d6. In a dice pool system, you can't have any attribute lower than 2, so you're always going to be rolling 2d6 as the minimum. So obviously, if you're playing Blade Runner, there's absolutely no difference because you're rolling 2d6 in both systems. But if you're playing Twilight 2000, then you're really rolling at significantly less odds because you're only rolling a single d6. And obviously, looking at the numbers there, you're comparing a 17% chance to succeed versus a 31%. And when you push, that's 31 versus 52. So quite big deltas there. Now let's look at adding one skill point to the mix. So you have the lowest possible attribute, but you have a little bit of training, okay? And in the step dice system, that's a d6 plus a d6, I guess. That's Blade Runner. I guess that's Blade Runner, and it's also Twilight 2000, so 2 dice. You could argue that because you start at d6 in Blade Runner, adding 1 dice to the mix would be a d8, but I think that's not quite comparing apples with apples, so to speak. So we're going to be looking at d6 plus d6, and really, again, it's super simple because we're just looking at d6s right now. You're looking at on the step side, 2 dice compared to 3 dice on the, or swap them around if you will, 3 dice on the dice pool side. And the differences there are 31% versus 42%, and when you're pushing, the differences are 52 versus 67. So quite significant differences there. Once you start adding more skills to the mix is when things start kind of balancing out, all right? And that is 2 attribute and 2 skill over here on the year 0, on the dice pool side. And on the stepped dice side, that would basically be a d6 plus a d8. So d6 plus d8 is 49% compared to 4 dice, which is 52%. That's a 3% difference. It's not that big. And when you push the dice, you're looking at a 74% versus a 77% difference. 3%, not a big deal. Let's take that one step further. Low attribute plus a little bit more, so stepping up the skills one more time. So on the step dice scale, that's d6 plus d10. And on the dice pool side of things, that is attribute of 2, skill of 3. So d6 plus d10 is 59%, 5 dice, 60%. Pushing them, that gives you 83% compared to 84%. We're talking now 1% difference between the two. That is low. That is negligible, in my opinion. So no real difference there. Now, there are lots of different combinations we could look at, but what I want to now do is jump into the middle of the scale and look at when you have an example of mid-range attribute, average to mid-range attribute, and let's say 2 skill points, okay? So on the stepped dice side of things, we're looking at a d8 plus a d8. Right in the middle of the table, really. And that is 61% chance of success. 5 dice is 60% chance for a dice pool. And when we push that, we're looking at 85% versus 84%. So once again, we're looking at a 1% difference in the odds compared to the two different systems. And really, that's more or less the case for a lot of the cases that I can look at. Sometimes it dips up to 2% difference, but really 1 or 2 was mostly 1% difference. It's very, very, very negligible. And looking at the very top end of the scale, if you're rolling the maximum that you can roll, that's a d12 plus a d12, 82%, versus 10 dice, 5 attribute plus 5 skill, 84%. That's a 2% difference between them. And when you're pushing them, they both go to 97%. So that's all I'm going to be looking at for probabilities. We could really do a deep dive and look at all the different combinations. I don't want to do that. Really, if you're looking at how the probabilities differ, it's negligible, and the big differences are at the low end of the spectrum. And really, that low end of the spectrum is really mainly with Twilight 2000, when you're only going to be rolling one die. So, looking at probabilities and thinking how different are these two dice mechanics when you're kind of comparing things, it really not that different. And the big difference at the tail end, I'm a big fan of, because when you're bad at something inherently, your odds should be a little bit worse, and that's just great. I mean, that's the BRP fan in me coming out, but really I think that's not really a big problem. And I quite like how there's suddenly a bigger jump in probabilities as you start getting either inherently better at something with higher attribute score, or more experienced in something in terms of higher skill points. So, in summary, is this going to be a trend with the Year Zero engine? I don't know. Again, I can't say. Is it a bad thing if it does become a trend? I don't think so. It's mechanically not that different. Really, the only difference here is in the feels, and whether or not you like it is probably going to come down to personal preference. And for me personally, I quite like both systems. I like having big handfuls of dice that I roll to see how many come up with sixes. It's quick, it's fast. I also am a dice junkie. I collect dice, and I like rolling different polyhedrals. And in fact, my favorite dice type is the D12, and having them there as like the best die is something that really appeals to me. And if you're thinking, okay, well, there's two different types of dice mechanic. You like how both of them feel. What's a dice mechanic you don't like the feel of? And what I don't like the feel of is Powered by the Apocalypse. 2d6 every single time just is boring. It doesn't have quite the same tactile feel as adding more dice to your hand or to your pool and rolling a big pile of dice to say, I'm really good at something, look at all these dice I'm rolling. Or here where it's like, I'm getting better at something, I'm now not rolling a d6, I'm rolling a d10 or a d12. And knowing that everything over a 6 on that is going to give you better odds. It's more tactile, it's a bit more exciting. And it might be a shallow thing, it might be a personal thing for me, but it just feels more exciting. Likewise, D20 systems and even BRP with a D100, those are very flat probability-wise. It's a flat probability compared to basically it's not really a bell curve here. Bell curve would be GURPS or Powered by the Apocalypse, but you have this kind of logarithmic sort of S-curve here for the Year Zero engine games. And when you look at these flat probabilities of a D20 and a D100, if you ignore the probabilities, it's still kind of boring. It's still very swingy. You roll a single D20 for all your resolution tests in D20 games, and it's very random. You either, that you have an equal chance of rolling 1 as you do a 20, and you're only ever rolling 1 dice all the time. Obviously, there are some games that kind of mess with that a little bit. For example, Shadow the Demon Lord, where you're adding some D6s to the mix. But really, it's a feels thing. And for me, I like the feels of the step dice mechanic. I'm actually probably going to be using this step dice mechanic in some of my own projects going forward, because I like the way it looks so much. And it's also a little bit hackable. I can think of ways already where I'm starting to think about how I can hack the advantage system, how I can hack the pushing system if I wanted to. So yeah, there's just a lot of things you can do with it. So ultimately, I'm quite excited for the change. I don't think it's the end of the world. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just a different thing, and the feels are different, but the feels are good in my opinion. But what do you think? Are the feels good for you? Do you prefer the dice pool system to the step dice system, or vice versa? Do you not like the Year Zero engine system at all? Do you prefer Powered by the Apocalypse 2d6 You're wrong if you do. Or you like D20s or D100s. Let me know in the comments. And yeah, I'd love to hear your opinions and what you think, especially about this new step dice mechanic. Anyway, that's me. I'm gonna stop here. So thanks so much for watching. This wouldn't be YouTube if I didn't plug my own channel. So if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more similar content. I also do a lot of solo stuff, so if solo playing is something you're interested in, then definitely subscribe to the channel. And yeah, if you hit the like button if you like this video, that will make me a very happy person, and making me happy should make you happy, so make yourself happy and smash that like button as well. Anyway, catch you next time. Cheers.